On the day the gates opened, the world fell into chaos. Countless monsters poured out of the gates and began destroying civilization as we know it. Dragons with the ability to shoot laser beams from their mouths, orcs that could shatter the ground with ease, and other various monsters made humanity their playthings. Of the countless humans who were helplessly dying to these unknown monsters, a select few were lucky enough to awaken supernatural abilities. They became known as the saviors of humanity, or hunters. One of these hunters, Lee Hyunwook, is an F-rank player known as the Great Steel Emperor, and he was called humanity's last hope. However, Lee believed his life has been royally fucked. The AMT, short for Anti-Monster Troop, is a place that hunters who have awakened are forced to serve, and in this place we see a team of soldiers getting disciplined. They had their heads on the ground and their ass in the air. One of these soldiers was Lee, who was questioning why he was in this position when he was humanity's last hope. They were in the shooting range, and the commanding officer shouted at them saying they were the strongest. He proceeded to scold them for losing track of 9 cartridges. As the commanding officer went on, Lee sneakily activated his power and he made a bullet case fall out of his pockets. He proceeded to use the power to bring the bullet case close to his mouth, and he ate it. The commanding officer asked the soldiers if they were in their right minds, and they all replied saying no. A notification appeared in front of Lee, informing him that he has 300 grams of metal currently available for manipulation. Lee stared at the message, and he thought about what the commanding officer said. He wondered how anyone would be in their right mind if this was their second time serving in the army. In his previous life, right before he regressed, Lee was crushed by the debris of a building, and while he laid there, a person approached him. Lee looked around, seeing the destroyed buildings and the countless corpses that covered the ground. He smiled, saying in the end it wasn't monsters that killed humanity, but hunters. The person that was approaching was surprised to see Lee on the ground. He called Lee by his name and said he was wrong. He told Lee that the divine creatures such as themselves have just judged humanity. Lee scoffed at the person. He told him that they weren't divine creatures. They were just villains, humans who sold their soul to the devil and began massacring their own kind. He says if he had known how to grow stronger a year, no even a day earlier, he would have been able to kill the so-called divine creatures with ease. The person smiled. He asked Lee if he was frustrated. He told him not to be sad, and said even if Lee had known earlier someone as useless as him would have died either way. He called for a monster, and as he walked away he says this kind of death is fitting for an F rank like Lee. The monster lifted its weapon in the air, and as it struck Lee called the person's name, Gordon Tracy. Just like that, Lee died. But he never expected that he would regress like in those man was he used to read. Another notification appeared on top of the one previously. The prompt congratulated him for realizing how to get stronger. The commanding officer told the soldiers that he would fix their rotten minds. He asked them to say soldier when he says 1, and mindset when he says 2. Lee gritted his teeth. He was fine with the fact that he returned to the past and lost all of his skills and stats. However, he hated the fact that he was in the army. Later that day, another commanding officer was taking roll call of Lee's platoon. Lee was out of it. He still hadn't come to terms that he had to go through the military again. The commanding officer told Lee's platoon that they will be on standby since they needed to do something before they ate. Lee raised his hands and asked for permission to speak. The commanding officer granted him permission, and Lee says he and the other soldiers are tired because they just got back from training. The commanding officer smiled menacingly, and as he approached, Lee realized that he had forgotten about this commanding officer that was known as the Army's garbage. The commanding officer Sanguk asked Lee if his squad should do the work instead. He tapped Lee's helmet and said they are just F rank who can't level up, so they should take on more work to compensate for their lack of talent. Sanguk asked Lee if his platoon would take responsibility if something urgent happens while they are working. This scene was beginning to gather a lot of attention, and there were some soldiers who agreed with what Sanguk was saying, and some who thought he was being too rough. However, Sanguk hadn't noticed the crowd. He asked Lee if he thought his platoon should have it easy just because they are corporals. Lee glared at Sanguk angrily. In his past life he never thought he would get past F rank, and he was beginning to wonder if he was this much of a loser back then. Sanguk noticed Lee glaring at him, and he asked Lee if he wanted to die. Lee remained silent, so Sanguk began to activate his skill. He reminded Lee that he is at D rank. Lee sneered at Sanguk and said his platoon would do what he wanted, but they should at least give them some food. This further irritated Sanguk. But before he could retaliate, Lee asked him to look around. Sanguk looked around, finally noticing the giant crowd that had formed because of his actions. Lee told Sanguk that the others might think he was being abusive, and he is worried he might get caught up in a weird rumor when he is supposed to be a great person in the future. Sanguk was puzzled because this isn't how he expected things to go, and with no other choice he agreed with Lee. Lee says since it was an order from him, his platoon will eat real fast and then get the work done. With this, Sanguk dismissed Lee's platoon. As they entered the dining hall to grab something to eat, Sanguk addressed the crowd telling them to go eat. One of the soldiers was standing beside Lee. He was in shock because he never expected Lee to do something like this. Lee turned around and told the soldier, Park Jummo, to go eat. He says he doesn't feel like eating. Then he walked away. Sang-uk was also left in a daze, because it felt like Lee had changed overnight. Lee made his way to a secluded spot. He gritted his teeth and praised himself. He says what he just did is nothing compared to what the bastard did. While remembering Gordon Tracy, he gritted his teeth even harder and called him a son of a bitch. Another notification appeared informing Lee that the metal absorption is complete, and the weight of metal currently available for manipulation is 309 grams. He could now manipulate one more. Lee stared at the notification. If he stayed like this, it was going to be hard to catch up to that bastard. He lifted his helmet, revealing a bunch of metal spoons. The thought of him leveling up without the others knowing made him smile. Inside the dining hall, Lee's platoon members began to ask around for the spoons. They approached Private Park Junmo and informed him that all the spoons were missing. Junmo was shocked because he doesn't know who would steal spoons. Outside the dining hall, Lee was busy devouring the spoons. But he still hadn't gotten used to the taste of steel. Another message appeared notifying Lee that metal absorption had begun. He had 13 minutes until the metal was absorbed, and the weight of metal he had available for manipulation is expected to increase by 1.25 grams. Lee took out a M7 bayonet. One M7 bayonet is 140 grams, and if Lee wanted to add more weight on it for impact, he would only be able to control one of the combat knives. Cartridges are just 1 gram, and spoons are only 1.25 grams. At this rate, it would take too long for him to catch up to where he was before he regressed. Lee wondered if he had no other option but to continue eating cartridge and spoons. He looked up at one of the towers, guessing that he will have to prepare for a gate that will appear in 3 days, because his goal is to kill a boss monster even though he is only level 1. He infused his mana into the combat knife, and he began to manipulate it. He was determined to show what it means to be an expert. 3 days later, at the 3rd Brigade 1st Battalion Station Namsan 5th Post, Lee and Junmo were on guard together. Junmo told Lee that he had changed recently. Lee looked at his watch, checking the time. He asked Junmo if his recent change is making him uncomfortable. Junmo said no, however Lee was not paying attention. He was focused on a message that had appeared. Lee's metal absorption was complete. He could now manipulate 6 grams more, and the total weight of metal currently available for manipulation was over 1,000. Junmo told Lee that what he meant was that he has changed for the better. Lee turned around and began approaching Junmo. This put Junmo on the defensive, and he asked Lee why he was approaching him all of the sudden. Lee stared at Junmo, and he asked him if he trusted him. Junmo told Lee that he trusted him, however Lee wondered how true that is. Later, near the soldiers' sleeping quarters, a gate opened and goblins began pouring out. The goblins observed the sleeping quarters from a cliff and they prepared to launch an attack. However, the one that would lead the attack was quickly struck down by a combat knife that was being manipulated by Lee. Lee couldn't stop smiling. He was so happy to see the goblins after having to wait 3 whole days. The goblin that Lee struck down was greatly injured, but it wasn't dead. The goblin used its blade for help and began to stand up. Lee was shocked. This was his first time failing an ambush, and he blamed it on the fact that he is level 1. He began to infuse his mana into the combat knife. He says to the goblin that this was his second chance at life, and he really doesn't like doing the same work twice. The goblin quickly recovered from Lee's attack, and it rushed at him. Lee told the goblin that if it dropped anything shitty, it would be dead to him for real, and he proceeded to cut the goblin's head clean off. This angered the other goblins. The dead goblin dropped something that piqued Lee's interest. He used his manipulation ability and he picked the red crystal that the goblin dropped and he brought it to his mouth. The goblins were confused and they stared at Lee like they had just seen a madman. Lee began to eat the crystal. It was disgusting, and he began to recall the stinky taste that mana steel had. A message appeared congratulating Lee for consuming mana steel, a metal of the other world. Lee knows the future and he needs to eat steel to grow stronger. This means if he eats everything he comes across from now on, it would be like living life on easy difficulty. He turned around and smiled at the goblins that were just waiting to make him stronger. The goblins got nervous because they had never seen a human eat a monster's core. This made them hesitant to attack. Lee infused his mana into the combat knife again, and he began to manipulate it. It was time for him to start. Previously, before Lee went to the gate's location, he covered Junmo's mouth and he asked him to speak quietly. He told Junmo that he could sense that metals are moving. This shocked Junmo, and he whispered to Lee saying he thought Lee could only sense metal he could see. He asked Lee if he could sense metal that he couldn't see as well. Of course, this was a lie, but Junmo doesn't know that. Junmo told Lee that if his powers got better, he should report it. Lee refused, and he told Junmo that the higher-ups wouldn't believe him if he says he could sense gates that couldn't be seen by modern devices. Puzzled, Junmo asked Lee if he had a plan. Lee grabbed the back of Junmo's neck and he stared at him intensely. He asked Junmo to promise him one thing. He told Junmo that he was going to check it out, but he wanted Junmo to stay at the post, and promised that he would never report this to the higher-ups. The reason why Lee wanted Junmo to make this promise is because if the military found out, they would take all the weapons for themselves. Back to the battle, both Lee and the goblins began to charge at each other. The goblins were first to strike. However, Lee was able to dodge their attack. He rolled on the ground and used the combat knife to cut the heels of the goblins, immobilizing them. The goblins began to cry out in pain. On top of a tree, what looked like the chief of the goblins watched angrily as Lee was cutting down the other goblins. Lee didn't kill the goblins, he left them alive because he wanted them to continue screaming. He became distracted and a goblin was able to sneak up on him. The goblin was about to strike Lee with its blade, however Lee quickly noticed. He infused his mana into one of the immobilized goblin's blade and he parried the goblin's strike, disarming it in the process. While the goblin was disarmed, he proceeded to cut its throat so the others could watch. His goal of maximizing their fear was working. The goblin's mana steel dropped and rolled next to Lee's feet. Lee addressed the goblins. He says that he died in his previous life because he was hit from behind, so how dare they try attacking him from behind. He told the goblins that if one more bastard attacks him from behind, he would eat that bastard alive. The goblins froze in place because of fear, and Lee stopped attacking them, believing that this was enough. He was wondering if he should get started with the main course now, even though he knows it's frustrating to find what he was looking for with his eyes. He began to scan the location for the cunning boss monster, the Goblin Shaman. Lee purposefully lets his guard down because he knows the Goblin Shaman won't miss its chance because it's not as stupid as the other goblins. And Lee was correct. The Goblin Shaman took one of the things it had tied around its neck, and it began to chant a spell. Lee started sensing the Goblin Shaman's mana and he smiled menacingly because his prey was here. The Goblin Shaman used the Earth Spike skill, and giant spiked pillars shot up from the ground Lee was standing on. The attack took out some of the other goblins, and Lee disappeared. At one of the posts, a soldier woke his platoon leader, informing him that the ground just shook. The platoon leader angrily asked the soldier if he was scared. He told the soldier that if he woke him up again for something so meaningless, he would kill him. Back at the gate, the Goblin Shaman started laughing because it believed Lee was dead. However, to its surprise, it heard Lee's voice saying he found its location. Using a goblin's blade, Lee attacked the Goblin Shaman, but it was able to dodge. Lee acted disappointed, saying the Goblin Shaman ruined his perfect shot. The Goblin Shaman started laughing, believing that it ruined Lee's sneak attack. Lee smiled, saying the Goblin Shaman is a dumbass for believing his acting. Lee revealed his real attack and sent the combat knife, aiming for the Goblin Shaman's head. However, the Goblin Shaman managed to catch Lee's knife. Lee was surprised. He couldn't believe the Goblin Shaman would be able to catch his combat knife. He smiled, saying it seemed like he really was a failure in the past. The Goblin Shaman angrily stared at Lee. Lee told the goblin that it shouldn't be angry about a small scratch when he sent a huge gang of goblins to attack. He asked the Goblin Shaman to come down so he could slice it up in one go. This was a bluff. He turned around questioning what he should do about the other goblins, since the boss, who was hiding, is now fighting him head-on. The other goblins were in high spirits now. A prompt appeared telling Lee to be cautious because he consumed mana rapidly in a short amount of time. His mana reserves were below 40%. Lee realized that this was a big problem, and since it comes to this, he has no other choice. He removed the safety from his gun, saying if he can't eat the Goblin Shaman, then they should die together, and even if it takes a long time. He promised that in the end he was going to eat the Goblin Shaman. Their battle was interrupted by Junmo, who was close by, calling for Lee. The Goblin Shaman quickly ordered the other goblins to attack Junmo. Seeing the goblins rushing at him, Junmo was frozen in place due to fear, and as he was about to be struck down by a goblin, Lee called out to him, telling him to get down. Junmo quickly ducked and covered his head, and Lee opened fire on the goblin. The goblin was pushed back, but the bullets had no effect. Lee manipulated one of the goblin's blades on the floor and attacked the goblin with it, but the goblin easily blocked the blade. The goblin opened its mouth widely and it started laughing. But it shouldn't have done this because Lee jumped at him and placed the barrel of his gun in the goblin's mouth, and he opened fire. After dealing with the goblin, Lee quickly turned around and he pointed his gun at the other goblins, however they were gone. This angered Lee because he missed his opportunity and he never expected the Goblin Shaman to be so cautious. Another platoon leader radioed in, asking each post for a report since he heard gunfire. Lee quickly reported that a gate had appeared in the area. He told the other platoon leader that the monsters are goblins, and that they left the area after the first skirmish. He also reported that there were no casualties in his post. An order was given from the higher-ups for Lee's post to be on standby to defend their post. Lee quickly realized that she would be arriving soon in some building, a red-haired woman, and a couple of soldiers quickly got ready to respond to the gate opening. This lady is the Ant's paladin, and her name is Seo Yunha, and when she arrives at the location, Lee knows she will stop the gate like she did in his previous life, and the military will take all the weapons. And the legendary item, adamantium, that dropped in his previous life would also be taken by the military. This legendary item was the ultimate item that made people call him the Steel Emperor. If he misses this chance to get it now, he won't get another chance for 4 years. And if that happens, he will be at the same level as his previous life. This made him determined to get the adamantium first. However, to do this he would need to clear the gate before the standby team arrives. Luckily, he knows that if it's goblins, they would need living human sacrifices. Junmo, who had passed out due to fear, woke up. He saw the goblin's corpse and screamed, questioning what was happening. However, Lee was too focused on tracking the goblins to notice the panicking Junmo. He wondered if the goblins would make their way to the city. But he quickly dismissed this thought because for goblins who hunt in packs, the population density is too high. The 6th post radioed and saying the goblins had arrived in their location. Lee smiled, and he radioed into the control team that his post will support the 6th post. The control team reminded him of the command that was given to his post, and they asked what F ranks would be able to do. Lee turned down the walkie-talkie and he began making his way to the 6th post. Junmo grabbed his leg, saying he shouldn't go because this won't stop with him being confined to the guardhouse. What he was doing was enough for a military trial. Lee told Junmo that the 6th post is composed of an archer and a mage. They are long-ranged hunters and wouldn't be able to handle the goblins, so if they don't receive help quickly, it's likely they would die. Junmu asked Lee if he thought going by himself would change anything, and Lee said he wasn't alone. He pointed at Junmo, saying he had him. Junmo looked confused, so Lee asked if he didn't hear him correctly. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then hit the like button.